Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're cracking open a stack of sources focused on one of the world's most incredible travel destinations, Turkey. Think ancient history, vibrant bazaars, stunning coastlines. I mean, it's really got it all.
It really does.
But for anyone planning a trip, practical questions come up. So we're taking a deep dive specifically into what these sources tell us about navigating Turkey as a tourist, safety tips, how to maybe dodge common scams, and figuring out the best ways to get around.
That's exactly it. Turkey is hugely popular, and for good reason. It's a place where continents and cultures collide in the most fascinating ways. And like any travel experience, really, being well-informed is probably your best tool to ensure your trip is amazing and, runs smoothly.
Absolutely. And to get you informed, we've pulled together a mix of perspectives here, insights from seasoned travel blogs, some formal safety reports, and also some real-world experiences shared in online forums.
A good mix.
Yeah. Our mission here is pretty simple. Sift through all this, pull out the most critical, actionable nuggets, and help you feel confident and prepared for your Turkish adventure. So let's get into it.
All right, first up, let's talk about the big picture. Overall safety for tourists in Turkey. The consensus across the sources we looked at is that, well, Turkey is generally considered safe for visitors.
Okay, that's always good to hear as a starting point. But generally safe can mean a lot of things, right? Did the sources give us any more specific data or comparisons?
They did, actually.
Really?
For instance, one source looked at specific cities, noting that Antalya has a crime index of 29.9, which is considered low, and a safety index of 70.9 that's high.
Okay, that's useful.
Yeah, and another one broader, suggesting that based on one particular international index numbio, I think it was referencing tracking perceived safety and crime, Turkey overall actually ranks statistically safer than both the U.S. and the U.K.
Wow, okay. That's quite a striking comparison. So if the general picture is safe, where do the sources indicate the main concerns lie for tourists? What should you really watch out for?
What really stands out pretty much across the board is that the primary safety issue highlighted is petty crime. So we're talking about things like pickpocketing, maybe bag snatching.
Right, the usual stuff in busy places.
Exactly. This risk is naturally concentrated in crowded areas and classic tourist hotspots, precisely where you'd expect to find it, much like in any major city globally, really. Several sources, including travel blogs like Vigilios and Chasing the Donkey, and even discussions specific to women travelers, mention this as the most probable kind of thing you might encounter.
Okay, so being street smart in busy places is key, just like you would be anywhere else. Makes sense. But the sources didn't shy away from mentioning more serious concerns either, did they?
No, they are pretty upfront about potential, albeit maybe less likely, risks. Terrorism, for example, is noted as a risk present throughout Turkey. However, sources are careful to point out that incidents specifically targeting tourists in popular destinations like Antalya have been rare. One even referenced Ministry of Interior data, suggesting no major terror incidents in Istanbul impacting tourists in the past 8 years or so.
Okay, that's reassuring context.
It is, but the advice is still consistent. Maintain vigilance, be aware of your surroundings, especially in crowded public spaces.
And this raises an important point about localized risks and, well, staying informed while you're there. The sources also mention civil unrest or protests, right? Particularly linked to political events.
Exactly. These can pop up, sometimes unexpectedly. The strong recommendation from the sources is definitely to keep an eye on local news while you're there, and, critically, to actively avoid any large gatherings or demonstrations.
Why is that?
Well, they can just become unpredictable and potentially unsafe very quickly. It's better to steer clear.
Got it. So it's not just the type of risk, but where you are in the country matters significantly. The sources really emphasize these geographical differences.
They absolutely did, and some official sources are very, very clear about this. The U.S. government's travel.state.gov, for instance, explicitly designates provinces near the Syrian border, places like Sirnak and Hakkari, and areas within 10 kilometers of the border itself as level 4. Do not travel.
Level 4?
Yeah, that's the highest level. And this is due to ongoing risks from terrorism, conflict, and unrest in those specific areas. They also list specific provinces in eastern and southeastern Turkey, like Batman, Diyarbakir, Gaziantep, places like that, where travel for their own government employees is restricted.
Okay, that makes a really big difference. So, for you as a tourist heading to the major destinations and maybe the Mediterranean coast, Istanbul, the overall message from these sources seems pretty reassuring then. While the country definitely has regions with significant issues, the main tourist areas are generally considered safe.
Right.
Your most likely concern is probably navigating that petty crime, which is something you can manage with just basic awareness, yeah?
Absolutely. And, well, building on that awareness, let's dive into another key area the sources cover: common scams. Now, this isn't about making you paranoid,
No, definitely not.
but it's about knowing what specific tactics are out there so you can spot them and hopefully avoid them easily.
Awareness is definitely your best defense. So, based on these sources, what are some of the classic tourist traps to watch out for?
Okay, several specific examples are detailed, often highlighted in resources like a local's guide to scams. One is labeled the alcohol situation.
Okay?
This refers to potential issues with fake or maybe watered-down alcoholic drinks.
Mm.
Apparently, this can sometimes happen in bars, particularly in tourist resort areas. The practical advice is pretty simple. If a drink tastes wrong, just send it back.
Mm.
And maybe do a quick check of recent reviews for the place before you settle in.
Good tip. Any others involving unsolicited services, someone trying to do something for you didn't ask for?
Ah, yes. Probably the most famous one mentioned is the great shoe cleaning debacle. It's described as like one of the oldest tricks in the book.
Right, I think I've heard of this one.
Yeah. Someone walking ahead of you accidentally drops a shoe brush. You, being a nice person, point it out or pick it up for them.
Huh.
And as a thank you, they insist on cleaning your shoes, which you didn't ask for, and then they demand an inflated payment. Knowing this specific scenario makes it pretty easy to just, smile and keep walking. Don't engage.
Got it. Watch out for dropped brushes and sudden offers of shoe shining. What about places where you might relax or spend a bit more time, like hotels or bars? Any scams there?
Sources mention being cautious about asking you to have a tab. So if you're frequently visiting a hotel, bar, or maybe a local spot, running a tab can sometimes open the door to overcharging or maybe extra items being sneakily added to your bill over time.
Ah, making it harder to track.
Exactly. It becomes difficult to dispute when you finally settle up. So the suggestion is maybe avoid tabs if you can, or keep a very close eye on them.
And what about just paying for everyday things? I saw mentions of where is my change and adding stuff to your bill. Those sound like universal issues, unfortunately.
They are, but sources highlight specific instances in Turkey.
Yeah.
Like in certain restaurants in really heavily touristed areas, Sultanahmet in Istanbul was mentioned, or maybe in bars.
How does it work?
It could be deliberately slow change, maybe hoping you'll forget or give up, or claiming you paid with a smaller bill than you did, or especially if you're in a group or maybe distracted, items appearing on your bill that you simply didn't order.
Right.
The strong advice here is pretty straightforward. Always check your bill carefully. Try to use exact change if possible, or pay with a card where you can. And for groups, maybe ask for separate bills right at the start that can save a lot of hassle later.
Okay, good practical tips. Now, there is a really interesting nuance in the sources about items that just sort of appear on your table, like water or nuts or bread. What's the deal there?
Ah, yes, this is the thought this was free scenario. The initial source gives examples of unasked for water, nuts, or maybe those little maize appetizer dishes being brought to your table.
And then showing up on the bill.
Exactly. But what's fascinating here, and something commentary on that source points out, is the cultural context. Apparently, locals also expect to pay for pretty much everything brought to the table unless it's explicitly stated as complimentary, like on the house.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the comment suggests that tourists sometimes expecting these items to be free can actually contribute to local frustration, and maybe sometimes leads to dishonest billing, taking advantage of that misunderstanding.
So it's potentially a mix of cultural expectation difference and maybe some opportunism.
Precisely. It's not always necessarily a malicious scam in every case, though dishonest billing definitely still happens. The takeaway is always just politely confirm if something brought to your table is complimentary or if it will be added to the bill. Just ask.
That's a great point about how cultural differences can sometimes play a role, not just, outright trying to rip you off. What about shopping and haggling? That's such a classic image of Turkey.
Haggling comes up, under haggling issues. One source suggests some shopkeepers might, quote, higher prices, yabancı, meaning foreigner prices, and even suggests maybe getting a trusted local to help you negotiate.
Okay.
But then there's a contrasting perspective, notably in the comments on that same source, arguing that actually in most modern Turkish stores, prices are fixed. Like in a regular shop or department store.
Right, like anywhere else.
Exactly. And that it might actually be the tourist insistence on bargaining in places where it isn't standard that sometimes leads to these different pricing dynamics, especially in really touristy areas. In traditional bazaars or maybe for big-ticket items like carpets, yes, bargaining is expected and part of the fun, but elsewhere, generally not.
Okay. So it's less about being targeted just for being a tourist everywhere and more about understanding the specific context when and where negotiation is actually appropriate.
That seems to be the nuance, yes. Knowing where it's part of the culture and where it isn't.
Got it. And taxis. Always a common tourist concern worldwide, isn't it?
Absolutely. The taxi scenic route is mentioned, particularly common, apparently, in Istanbul. Drivers taking a much longer path than necessary to inflate the fare on the meter.
Ugh, the worst.
Yeah. The advice here is key. Insist the meter is turned on immediately when you get in. Or, maybe better for longer trips, or, if you're unsure, agree on a rough price before you start the journey. That shows you're aware.
Okay. And just basic common sense stuff, but probably worth repeating.
Yeah, just be wary in your hotel room.
Uh,
The sources simply remind you to use the room safe for your valuables, passport, cash, jewelry. Opportunistic theft by staff is rare, but it can happen anywhere. And if something goes missing from, say, your nightstand instead of the safe, proving the loss is incredibly difficult, almost impossible.
Good reminder. Finally, there was a slightly more vague mention of the walk on the beach. What was that about?
Uh, that seems to refer to potentially unwanted attention towards female tourists, specifically from some local men. The sources note it's perhaps less prevalent now than it might have been historically, but still something, particularly for women traveling alone, to just be aware of as a possibility.
Okay. So, summing up the whole scam picture then, it's really not about walking around terrified or distrustful of everyone.
Not at all.
It's more about being prepared for these specific known scenarios, from the drop brush to checking your change and your bills diligently. Knowing these common tricks significantly reduces your chance of being caught out, right? And that lets you relax and enjoy your interactions more genuinely.
Exactly right. Now, moving on from general safety and scams, the sources also offered some specific insights, particularly focusing on safety for women travelers. They generally reinforce that Turkey is considered safe for solo female travelers, but like anywhere, taking sensible precautions definitely makes a big difference.
And the sources gave some clear, pretty actionable tips here. What did they recommend specifically for women?
Okay, so dress modestly. This comes up often, especially when visiting religious sites like mosques. Carrying a scarf to cover your head is practical for that, or if you're traveling in more conservative regions, particularly in eastern Turkey.
But less so in big cities or coastal areas?
Generally, yes. In places like Istanbul, Izmir, or along the Mediterranean coast, Western-style clothing is much more common and generally accepted. It's about context.
Right. Location and accommodation seem important too, based on the sources.
Yes. Choosing secure accommodation with good, recent reviews, preferably situated in well-lit, tourist-frequented areas, is definitely stressed. And exercising caution when using transportation, especially at night or maybe in unfamiliar spots. Stick to official taxis or use reputable ride-sharing apps if they're available, and prefer well-lit streets if walking.
What about dealing with unwanted attention like street harassment?
Sources suggest being aware can happen. The general advice is to politely but firmly decline any persistent vendors or unwanted approaches, and maybe to just ignore catcallers without engaging or confronting them. Confrontation can sometimes escalate things unnecessarily, so often ignoring it is the best strategy.
It's interesting how location came up again specifically in this context of female safety.
It is. There was a Reddit thread discussed in one source where contributors were specifically comparing different cities for solo female safety. Antalya was generally seen as a pretty safe bet compared to maybe places like Mardin in the southeast. Izmir was also suggested as a good option, though someone noted it could be potentially more challenging just to navigate because of its size and traffic.
So that really emphasizes that while the general advice applies across the board, your specific destination within Turkey can impact your experience and what you need to be mindful of.
Definitely. It shows that nuance matters.
And for those looking for maybe an extra layer of comfort or perhaps a built-in social group, one practical tip mentioned was about joining tours.
Exactly. Joining a women's tour group was presented not only as objectively a safer option, because you have that built-in security and logistical support from the guiding group,
Right, safety in numbers.
but also potentially just more enjoyable because of the shared experience and camaraderie. Something to consider.
All right, so we've talked safety, we've talked avoiding pitfalls and scams. Now, how do you actually traverse this amazing country once you're there? What did the sources tell us about getting around transportation options?
Okay, yeah. Public transportation comes up generally as being reliable and quite affordable, particularly within the major cities like Antalya and Istanbul.
The sources detailed quite a few options. Buses seem pretty extensive.
Very.
Yeah.
Good networks, both within cities and connecting nearby towns and regions.
Yeah.
In Antalya, for example, they mention specific types: green municipal buses and red private ones. You often need a local transit card, like an Antalya card, or sometimes you can use contactless payment now.
Hmm.
And the entry system in Antalya, that's their sort of bus rapid transit or tram line, was specifically mentioned as being fast, comfortable, and even connects out to the airport, which is useful.
And trams generally.
Trams are highlighted as being really convenient for tourists, especially in city centers like Antalya's old town, Kalesi. They often stop near key historical sites and popular hotel areas. Plus, they're usually air-conditioned, which is a big plus in summer, and easy to use with the same transit cards as the buses.
Makes sense. And being on the coast, ferries must be part of the picture too.
For sure, especially along the Aegean and Mediterranean coasts. They're available for connecting seaside towns or maybe doing scenic trips to explore bays and islands,
Mm.
like from the Kalesi Marina in Antalya. Sources describe them as reliable and pretty frequent during the main season.
Okay, so good public options. What about taxis for more direct trips?
Taxis are widely available, as you'd expect, but the absolute key piece of advice repeated across pretty much all sources regarding taxis is simple. Insist on using the meter. Taximeter, they call it.
Right, always the meter.
Always. If the driver refuses or claims it's broken, which can happen, the advice is just find a different taxi. Or, if it's a longer journey or you feel unsure, agree on the price before you get in. Make sure you both understand the fare up front.
And there were several other specific tips for avoiding taxi trouble, weren't there?
Yes, definitely. Beyond verifying the meter, sources advise maybe having your destination written down clearly or using a translation app on your phone. This helps avoid confusion or, let's be honest, sometimes intentional misunderstandings about where you want to go.
Good idea.
Also, try to stick to official taxi stands, especially at airports or stations, or use taxis associated with licensed companies rather than just hailing one randomly on a quiet street. For longer trips, like from the airport into the city, agreeing on a fixed price beforehand is often the best approach.
And the change issue.
Yeah, be cautious about drivers claiming they don't have change for larger bills. It's always helpful to carry some smaller denomination Turkish lira notes for taxis and small purchases.
Now, you pointed an interesting slight difference or potential conflict in the sources regarding taxis, though. Something about color.
Yes, it was a minor point, but interesting. One source mentioned yellow taxis specifically as being the standard, kind of implying they are the official licensed ones,
Hmm?
particularly noted in the context of Antalya.
Okay.
However, a comment on an online forum explicitly advised avoiding yellow taxis in Istanbul, claiming they were notorious for overcharging tourists there. Instead, they recommended turquoise or black taxis in Istanbul, which are often seen as more premium or reliable, though potentially pricier.
Huh. So it really depends on the city.
It seems so. It just reminds us that even within the same country, the best advice or local practices can vary significantly by city. It really underscores the value of checking recent location-specific advice if you can, maybe from your hotel or recent travel forums for that specific city.
That's a really good point. Local, up-to-date knowledge adds a lot. What about the freedom of having your own vehicle? Did the sources cover renting cars or scooters?
They did. Renting obviously offers great flexibility, especially if you want to explore beyond the main tourist hubs or coastal resorts. Get off the beaten path a bit.
But there's always a but.
There is. The sources universally caution that traffic, especially in big cities, can be quite chaotic. Driving habits can seem aggressive to visitors from some other countries, and road conditions might be inconsistent once you get off the main highways. Driving at night in rural areas was specifically mentioned as needing extra caution.
Do you need a special license?
For cars, you might need an International Driving Permit, IDP, along with your home country license, especially depending on how long you're staying. Best to check the requirements before you go. Scooters were noted as potentially useful for weaving through city traffic, but obviously come with their own significant safety considerations. Proper gear and experience are crucial.
Okay. And to wrap up transport, any general safety tips that came up?
Yes, just some common sense reminders. Sources suggest avoiding rush hour if you can, which is typically around 7 to 9 a.m., and maybe 4 to 7 p.m. in big cities. Use smartphone navigation apps like Google Maps or local transit apps. They work well. And generally, just be attentive when you're moving around. Keep your belongings close. Don't make a big display of expensive items or lots of cash while on public transport or walking. Safety is important. That was a theme.
Makes sense. Pay attention, basically.
Exactly. Now, beyond the very practical stuff of safety and transport, the sources also touched on cultural context and some other important considerations that can really, enhance your visit and maybe help you avoid unintentional missteps.
Right, because understanding the local culture is always helpful when you travel. What kind of cultural points came up that are particularly relevant for tourists?
Well, modesty in dress was reiterated, especially for visiting religious sites, as we mentioned. Respect during the holy month of Ramadan was also highlighted, being mindful of people who are fasting during daylight hours.
Yeah, and Turkish hospitality.
Yes, it's famous, and the sources mention it. Things like accepting offers of tea or coffee, even in shops sometimes, is generally seen as polite. And removing your shoes when entering someone's home is a standard custom. Also, where haggling is appropriate, like in the Grand Bazaar, doing so respectfully and with good humor is key. It's a social interaction, not just about price.
Any specific gestures we should avoid doing?
Yes, a couple were noted. Pointing directly at someone with your index finger is considered rude, and showing the soles of your feet towards someone is also seen as disrespectful. Just small things to be aware of.
Okay. What about on the legal side? Anything visitors really need to know?
A few important points. Always carry at least a copy of your ID or passport. Authorities apparently have the right to ask for it and sometimes do. Sources also highlight being careful about sensitive topics. Insulting the Turkish state or its founder, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, is actually illegal.
Seriously, even online.
Yes, and this explicitly extends to social media posts. So you need to be quite cautious about what you might share or comment on online while you're there, or even before you go if it's public. Drug laws are also extremely strict, with very severe penalties, so absolutely steer clear of anything related to illegal drugs.
Anything else? Artifacts.
Right, that's a big one too. If you're interested in buying antiques or cultural artifacts, be extremely careful. You need official certificates from authorized museums or dealers to legally export them. Trying to take historical items out of the country without permission can lead to arrest and serious charges. Best stick to regular souvenirs unless you really know the rules.
Wow, okay, good to know. In terms of health, what did the sources mention? Besides the usual travel advice.
Well, they noted that while hospitals in major cities are generally good, medical costs can be high for visitors who aren't covered. So comprehensive travel insurance that specifically includes medical evacuation coverage is strongly recommended by multiple sources.
And basic health precautions.
Traveler's diarrhea is pretty common, as it is in many places. So sticking to bottled or properly purified water is the standard, sensible advice. Avoid tap water for drinking.
Got it. What if you do need help? Emergency numbers.
The single emergency number across all of Turkey for police, ambulance, fire is 112. Easy to remember. And in popular tourist areas, there are often dedicated tourist police who are specifically there to assist visitors and usually speak some English.
Okay, 112. Good. Finally, natural events came up briefly too, right?
Right, just an awareness thing. Turkey's located in a seismically active zone, so earthquakes can and do occur. It's probably wise just to quickly familiarize yourself with basic earthquake safety procedures wherever you stay. Also, floods can be possible during heavy winter rains in some areas, and unfortunately, wildfires can be a risk in the hot, dry summer months, especially near forested coastal areas. Just things to be generally aware of depending on when and where you travel.
Okay, so that's a lot of ground covered. Bringing all these pieces together then, the overall safety picture, the specific scam warnings, the transport guidance, cultural notes, legal points, health, emergencies. What does it all really mean for you, the listener, as you look forward to your trip to Turkey, or maybe you're even listening to this while you're there?
Well, I think the key takeaway from synthesizing all these sources isn't that you need to be constantly worried or on edge. It's actually quite the opposite in many ways.
Tough out.
It's that the vast majority of your experience in Turkey is likely to be safe, positive, and incredibly rewarding. The risks that do exist, whether it's the higher chance of petty crime in some spots, those specific scams we talked about, or the more serious safety considerations, depending on exactly where you go, they seem largely manageable simply by being informed and prepared.
Right. It's knowledge that empowers you rather than scares you.
Exactly. Having this kind of knowledge, knowing what scams look like, understanding how the public transport works, being mindful of key cultural norms, and just being aware of general safety tips It empowers you to navigate the country with more confidence.
And that confidence, presumably, is what allows you to truly relax, be present, and actually soak in everything amazing that Turkey has to offer: the incredible history, the welcoming people, the stunning landscapes, the delicious food, all of it.
Precisely. It's about using this knowledge not to build walls or restrict your experience, but actually to enhance it and make it smoother, safer, and ultimately more enjoyable.
We've certainly covered a significant amount in this deep dive into being a tourist in Turkey, pulling out those key insights from your sources on safety, common scams, getting around, and those other important considerations.
Yeah, these insights from the broad safety statistics right down to the drop shoe brush scam scenario hopefully help paint a clearer, more practical picture of what to expect and how you can best prepare for your visit.
And that leaves us, as always, with a question worth pondering as you maybe plan your trip or just reflect on your travels in general. Given everything we've discussed about the necessary caution and awareness, how do you balance that?
Hmm.
How do you balance being careful with remaining open and receptive enough to genuinely experience the famed Turkish hospitality and make those authentic connections that the sources also hint are such a big part of visiting Turkey? How do you use knowledge to stay safe without letting it build walls that might prevent you from truly engaging with the wonder of the place and its people?
That's a great question. Finding that balance is key to travel anywhere, isn't it?
It really is. Something to think about. Well, that's it for this deep dive into navigating Turkey as a tourist. We sincerely hope this helps you feel well informed and ready for what sounds like a truly fantastic trip.